You know, I'm not a very political person in the, Democratic, Republican, Independent sense. I've never belonged to a political party. But I do find politicians interesting. How can they not be interesting? And I'm thinking today of the very famous Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who during the Depression, his big rhetoric was to have a series of what he called fireside chats. He sat by the fireplace and sort of talked to this country. And what could be more American than that? So I know it sounds kind of corny and kind of cheesy, but I thought today we would have a brief fireside chat or a wood stove chat about writing, about sentences, which has been the theme for the last couple of videos that I've shown you. In particular today, now that we're talking about America, I'm thinking of two lessons that I think we can take from two of the greatest writers of the 20th century. I adore both of them, even though they're very different writers, very different prose stylists. And what I'm talking about is the great Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner. Both of these writers are people that I could talk about for hours, and if we had the time, I surely would. But the thing that I really want to focus on is the idea that they both, on the other end of the 20th century, were in this big battle to be America's favorite writer. They didn't like each other very much as a result, and William Faulkner wasn't even within striking range. Ernest Hemingway won that battle completely because of his novels, because of his writing. To this minute, we pay attention to him because he's bigger than life. And he had probably more impact on writers than any other that I can think of in the early part of the 20th century. I think I might have mentioned before, for a long time in this country, America's writers were haunted by the great prose stylists of Europe. And you'll see that if you go back in the 19th century and take a look at, for instance, the prose of Melville or Hawthorne or James Fenimore Cooper. Those guys were really going for it with the big epic sentences. Real quickly, two American writers came along in kind of a 1-2 punch deal, pretty much disabled the grand style. They sort of took it down. The first of these was Mark Twain. The second of these was the great Ernest Hemingway. Even if you've never read Ernest Hemingway, if you've never picked up one of his books, maybe if you don't even know who he is, he has had an effect on you and on your writing. He's just tremendously influential, and he gives us a demonstration of the plain style and how it can be used, although don't be too deceived by that. He was also capable of Faulknerific sentences too. William Faulkner, on the other hand, instead of traveling all over the world and being followed by paparazzi, he pretty much locked himself up in this farmhouse down in Oxford, Mississippi, in his little sort of a former plantation down there called Roanoke. And he created, with his 18-odd novels, a completely different kind of literature. And what I'd like to do today is sort of, we'll turn things around here. I've got a nice white wall in here. I'd like to show you two very different sentences by two very different writers. One of them is called the periodic sentence. It's a relatively brief sentence that may have one or two clusters, like I've talked about earlier, and then you get a period, and that ends it. Hemingway was famous for those. And then we have William Faulkner, who comes along and crafts the sentences that were probably more the territory of my little thesis that I showed you in the previous lesson. Faulkner wanted to be grand, he wanted to be epic, and his sentences sometimes went on and on and on. They accumulated in meaning because they had multiple clusters. And I'd like to show you both of these, and maybe there'll be a lesson in it for you. You need to be able to write short periodic sentences. I'm not extolling them as the only sentence that has any kind of virtue. Sometimes I like a nice, dead, simple sentence that's clear, that conveys its meaning. There's other times, though, when I'm reading, where I really want to luxuriate and celebrate and just sort of look and disentangle a sentence that really goes for it, like William Faulkner was very famous for. So let's go to the big whiteboard here and have a look. First, if I could make a little editorial comment and tease a couple of former students here on the internet. I've noticed something over the years. I've noticed that plagiarism, for instance, runs in families. You know, an entire family will come along and give you 2, 3, 4 plagiarists right in a row. I'm not going to tell you any stories about that or mention names there. But I've also noticed that once in a while, a distaste for the prose of Ernest Hemingway runs in families. And here I'm thinking about Gita and Maria Alvarez. You know, Gita Alvarez came along as one of my sophomores many years ago, and she took a look at the prose of Ernest Hemingway, and she said, you know what, a fifth grader could write like this. Take a look at these sentences. They're so simple, I don't even need to read them to you. These are sentences that actually occur in a short story called The Short Happy Life of Francis McComber. I think it's one of the finest stories written by an American, and it is among the things that Ernest Hemingway very deservedly earned the Nobel Prize for. Gita Alvarez took a look at these sentences. There was a good smell, and she said, my goodness sakes, a chimp could write that. I remember one day she completely refused to read The Old Man and the Sea because she believed it should be rewritten. I remember another day where she held open an anthology to an Ernest Hemingway story and said, put your finger anywhere and then read out loud the sentence that it lands on. And I said to her, I tried to convince her, okay, future English major, which is what she was, she went and took a degree in creative writing. If you do that, Hemingway falls apart. Yes, these are short, safe, periodic sentences, but if you look at them in isolation, you lose the big picture and what he was really trying to do, which was to write like a journalist. These sentences are one-level sentences. They have one level of generality. Ernest Hemingway William Faulkner, meanwhile, several hundred miles south of Chicago, where Ernest Hemingway was from, oh my gosh, he wrote very different sentences. He wrote what Francis Christian would call cumulative or accumulative. They accumulated in meaning. He kept adding and adding and adding. And one of the sentences that I admire, and this is right out of the book that he wrote about Faulkner, or at least mentioned him repeatedly. Here's one of his famous ones. This is very different from Ernest Hemingway, and this is a sentence that comes from William Faulkner's very famous story, The Bear. And let's have a look at it. The dogs were there first, 10 of them, huddled back under the kitchen. Himself and Sam squatting to peer back into the obscurity where they crouched. Quiet, the eyes rolling and luminous, vanishing, and no sound. Only that effluvium which the boy could not place yet, of something more than dog, stronger than dog, and not just animal, just beast even. Goofed up reading that a little bit because I left my glasses at a cafe where I had dinner and breakfast with a friend this morning. I'm doing my best. Also got a cold. But I think you see this as a very different sentence. This has far more than one cluster or one level of generality. It has multiple. Now, if Hemingway had written this sentence, he would have just said, well, you know, Sam and Isaac McCaslin peered under the porch and saw some stinky dogs. That's what the word effluvium means. It's a funky smell. But here's what I like to do once in a while with a sentence. I just take a look at something like this and I go, my gosh, look at that. You just chiseled that. And indeed, if you take that sentence and break it up so you can sort of see how it works, disentangle the meaning, you'll see something very different emerges, Faulkner from Hemingway-wise. Now I probably might appear like I'm taking the sentence and tying it to a chair and beating it with a rubber hose till it yields all its meaning. I don't want to do that, but I do want you to admire what Aristotle would call the techne, or the technique here. Look at this sentence as it unfolds in all of its clusters. And how many do we have? And look at each cluster. Each cluster sort of answers a question. The dogs were there first. Who was there? The dogs. Well, how many of them and where were they? Well, there were 10 of them, and they were huddled back under the kitchen. And what kind of sound were they making? None. They were quiet. What did their eyes look like? Their eyes were rolling and luminous. And look at this unbelievably gorgeous sentence. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 odd clusters. And like I was telling you earlier, this is a great sentence to me because the clusters are short and they're balanced and they're in control. As aspiring writers, I see this in your writing too. You too are able to write a sentence that goes 1, 2, 3, even 4, 5, 6 clusters long. But the trick is to keep those clusters short and balanced. I know I'm repeating myself, but earlier in a video I mentioned that 18-year-old writers in particular, once they sort of get that facility with language, they're able to pile meaning onto meaning. The clusters get too long, they fall apart. Like I said earlier, their endings do forget their meanings. You need to be able to write periodic sentences that are relatively short and safe. You also need to be able to reach and aspire to structures like this that are more complicated and more sophisticated. You need to go back and forth too. I was just telling my Johnnies and Bennies at my little part-time teaching job over at the College of St. Benedict. I picked one paper up after another where the sentences were really about the same length. And they need to sort of breathe in and out. They need to go back and forth. If you're ever curious about whether or not you're achieving that with one of your papers, It's dead simple. Go take a paragraph or two paragraphs, go to the end of the paragraph, put the cursor by the period, and then just hit return. And what you want to see are those sentences going back and forth, short ones, long ones, medium ones. It gets a little tone deaf. It gets a little boring, actually. If you hand someone a paper and those sentences are all the same length. So in some, we have periodic sentences and we have cumulative sentences. But it is the cumulative sentence, when you head out to create one of those babies, where you sort of are just going to discover things that really, really might surprise you. I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're both important, and I love them both. Kind of in the same way that I just adore, on a snowy day like today, curling up with Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, and all the rest of my friends on this bookshelf. See you in the next lesson.